The European knights could be fierce foes, but ultimately their confrontations with the Mongols were limited, and in the largest battles the Mongols came out on top. In contrast, for the final part in our series on Mongol Heavy Cavalry, we deal with a foe who consistently proved able to defeat Mongol armies, the Mamluks of Egypt. The Mamluks with whom the Mongols fought were largely of Kipchak origin, sold into service as boys to the Ayyubid Sultanate of Egypt. Trained from a young age and provided excellent equipment, there's good reason to argue that the Mamluks were the best heavy cavalry in the world in the 13th century. I'm sure someone has already run down to the comments section to start an argument about that. In the aftermath of Louis IX's failed crusade in Egypt in 1250, the Mamluks overthrew the last of the Ayyubids in Egypt, though they spent the next decade fighting each other for control over Cairo. At the time of the Mongol invasion, the famous Baibars was sheltering with Ayyubids in Syria, because his hated rival Qutuz was then in power in Cairo. With the advance of Hulagu after the sack of Baghdad, Baibars abandoned the doomed Ayyubids of Syria and returned to Egypt, forming a tense alliance with Qutuz. They prepared for a Mongol invasion which did not materialize. Early in 1260, Hulagu withdrew from Syria, leaving behind a force of about 20,000 under Kitpuka and Noyan to occupy the Levant and prepare the grounds for an invasion of Egypt in winter 1260. However, while spending the summer of 1260 in the cooler pastures of the Caucasus, Hulagu learned of the death of his older brother, Great Khan Mongol. Hulagu's attention was then turned to seizing for himself most of the local territory, something dealt with in my video on the Berke-Hulagu War. But the impending invasion of Egypt was called off, and Kitpuka's troops remained dispersed in the pasturage through Syria and Palestine. In the meantime, Qutuz and Baybars took the opportunity to strike at Kitpuka in the absence of the main Mongol army, since now their strengths were at parity. In July 1260, the Mamluk army marched out from Cairo, forcing a surprised Kitpuka to suddenly recall his troops and meet the Mongol army at Ain Jalut on September 3rd, 1260. The Battle of Ain Jalut is the most famous Mongol defeat. It's popular in some circles to portray it as an easy win for the Mamluks, but what the sources indicate is a hard-fought, closely run thing. The sources describe how the Mamluk emirs were afraid even to meet the Mongols in the field and had to be shamed by Baybars and Qutuz, who threatened to march out against the Mongols themselves if the emirs did not join them. Even during the battle, the Mamluk forces were pushed back twice by Mongol charges. Though not explicitly stated, it seems these were the same sort of heavy cavalry vanguard charges we've previously seen. The charges nearly broke the Mamluks, only to be rallied by Baybars and Qutuz. Online you'll see a lot of really bad efforts to try and explain the Mamluk victory. A common one to say is that the Mamluks outnumbered the Mongols. While the Mamluk army may have had a slight numerical advantage, the armies were probably fairly close in size. Numbers are hard to judge since both forces were augmented by subjects, allies, and refugees, and both armies had a large portion of Ayyubid troops fighting for them. Other people like to claim that the Mamluks used gunpowder weapons to win the battle, but the only mention of gunpowder at Ain Jalut comes from later Mamluk military treatises that were trying to glorify gunpowder weapons, and it seems unlikely they were actually used in the battle. Three factors best explain the Mamluk victory. The first was leadership. This has been something that has popped up across this series, but good leadership, which kept command of the army through the hardest situations, is often the difference between victory and defeat. We've noted already how key to a number of Mongol victories were well-timed heavy cavalry charges, taking advantage of opportune moments to scatter the foe. It appears Kitpuka tried the same thing at Ain Jalut, and nearly worked, had it not been for Baybars' and Qutuz's ability to rally their troops. Kitpuka was an experienced and able commander in his own right, but he was edged out by the Mamluk leaders. The second factor leading to a Mamluk victory, and the one most often ignored in retellings, was the defection or desertion of the force on the Mongol left flank. This was commanded by their vassal, the newly appointed Ayyubid prince of Syria, al-Ashraf Musa. Either through prior cooperation with the Mamluks, or his own initiative, during the battle he took his army and left the field. This allowed the Mongol left to be encircled by the Mamluks. Once they held the Mongol army in place, the Mamluks denied the Mongols their accustomed maneuverability, forcing them into prolonged, close quarters combat. Here, it appears the average Mamluk was better equipped and better trained for this sort of fighting. As stated already, the Mamluks were professional slave soldiers. Taken as young boys from the steppe, even as youths they were already excellent horsemen. Once in Egypt, the Sultanate oversaw their training in both archery, further horsemanship, unit tactics, and for close combat. At least for the higher ranks of the Mamluks, they were provided arms, armor, horses, and bows, all of professional quality. The Mamluks, in their prime, were well suited to both close combat and horse archery. Armed with high-quality bows, they could compete at range with the Mongols. Armed with lances, they could lead fearsome, tight-knit charges, and at close range, mace and sword were used. Rider and horse were both protected by mail, lamellar, and laminar armors, as the Mongols and their subjects were, but it's often presumed a greater percentage of the core of the Mamluk army was more armored than the Mongols. The Mongols may have had an advantage in maneuverability and number of horses and were more experienced horsemen. Roivan Amatai has argued the evidence for training of armies points to the Mongols having better training for large-scale unit warfare and movement, whereas the Mamluks seem to have prioritized the training of small tactical units, further emphasizing the need for them to deny the Mongols mobility. The Mamluks were highly effective anti-horse archer units, capable of engaging at range, on the charge, or in close combat, and protected for all circumstances. And in a medieval context, that made you pretty effective against most armies, as the Crusader states would find to their misfortune. When you combine that with skilled leaders like Qutuz and Baybars, it made the Mamluk army able to withstand, even if barely, the same shocks that broke most armies that faced the Mongols. Leadership and the defection of al-Ashraf Musa negated the Mongols' advantages, and being able to envelop the Mongol army granted the Mamluks victory in September 1260. Ayn Jalut, though, was only the beginning of Mongol-Mamluk warfare, which continued for another 60 years until a peace treaty in the 1360s. The Mongols were not dissuaded and continued to invade the region. Yet on only one occasion were the Mongols victorious over a major Mamluk army, at Wadi al-Khaznadar in 1299. Now, a lot of factors went into this Mamluk defense system, which goes far beyond just a battlefield. I detailed this in this video for kings and generals. So what do we see in these other battles? Unfortunately, the sources tend to treat maneuvers in a rather cursory manner. We see the Mongols continue to use Georgian and Armenian cavalry, commonly assumed to be fighting as heavy cavalry. The Mamluks also continue to expand their ranks and import not just more Kipchak slaves from the Golden Horde, but even Mongol refugees, either fleeing defeat or sold as slaves during Mongol civil wars. These Mongol troops in particular became highly valued not just for military ability, but also what they informed the Mamluks about Mongol tactics. They had good political value too, scoring points with the Golden Horde in particular, whose wars with the Ilkhanate took a lot of pressure off of the Mamluks. Favors and fortune were heaped upon the Mongols in Egypt by the sultans, with Baibars himself taking 3 Mongol women as wives, while the longest reigning Mamluk sultan, al-Nasir Muhammad, had a Mongolian mother, and one Oirat refugee, named ironically enough Kitpulka, became sultan. For a time, the Mongol Vafidia, particularly the Oirat who came in the 1290s, were their own elite faction within the Mamluk state, much to the displeasure of the existing Kipchak military elite. Much of the favors they received may have taken the form of arming them as elite military units, presumably as heavier cavalry, though it must be stressed that this is a presumption based on other cases, and so far I have not found it explicitly described in Mamluk chronicles. It's important to also mark the distinction between the Sultan's royal Mamluks compared to the majority of the army, like the Halqa, where both training and equipment would be much more uneven. So with a presumed expansion of heavy cavalry, what do sources say of these later Mamluk-Mongol battles? The best modern overview of these battles comes from Roivan Amatai's monograph Mongols and Mamluks. Amatai notes a common trend, as the sources are consistent in how almost every major battle the Mongols attacked first. What appears to be happening is the same thing our Chinese sources described for the wars against the Jin. Waves of horse archers loosing arrows at Mongol ranks, and then the Mongols judging at a certain time it was appropriate to unleash a direct charge into the Mamluk lines. And here's where the heavy cavalry vanguard comes into play, which in the Ilkhanate case was Mongols, Georgians, Armenians. At Elbistan in 1277, where the Mamluk lines were unorganized entering the valley, the Mongols opened up with this heavy cavalry charge right away, counting on it to scatter the Mamluks while they were unprepared. The difference from other armies the Mongols faced is that the Mamluks were really good at standing their ground in the face of all this. In fact, it appears the Mamluk forces remained mostly static while the Mongols charged at them. We can assume the Mamluks used this opportunity to fire arrows into the approaching Mongols, fouling the charge and reminiscent of Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu's similar tactic used against the Mongols at Parvan. Once the lines closed, perhaps the Mamluks responded with a last-minute countercharge of their own, and then faced the Mongols in close combat. As we demonstrated before, the purpose of the Mongol Heavy Cavalry was not to engage in prolonged combat with the foe, but to strike hard and break their morale, chasing them from the field. If this did not work, then the charges would be repeated, with a hope that the foe may follow and be brought into a feigned retreat. What the Mamluks do is foil this, standing firm against the opening barrage, forcing the Mongols into this prolonged close combat and not falling for feigned retreats. At Elbistan in 1277 and the Second Battle of Homs in 1281, when the battle began to go poorly for the Mongols, they dismounted to shoot back at the Mamluks. Roivan Amatai took this as a sign of the Mongols' willingness to fight to the death, their horses too exhausted to keep running about. This was also perhaps a Mongol attempt to, with a more stable platform for the archers, shoot down approaching Mamluk cavalry in the manner Jalal ad-Din had once done to them, seeking to rely on precise shots, searching for gaps in Mamluk armor to stagger their charges. Whatever the plan, it did not work, as the Mamluks were victorious in both of these battles, though at times they were still very close. In Ibn Abd al-Rahim's continuation of Ibn Vassal's Chronicle, he records Sultan Baybars' displeasure following the Battle of Elbistan, how Baybars had thought 10,000 of his riders could defeat 30,000 Mongols, but instead at Elbistan watched how 7,000 Mongols had charged and caused his left wing, including a large corps of experienced Zahiri royal Mamluks, to break and nearly defeated the Sultan. Luckily, Baybars, always a skilled commander, managed to reorganize his force and win the day. These Mongol charges were not something the Mamluks took lightly. So what changed for the Mongols' only major victory over Mamluk forces at Wadi al-Khaznadar in 1299? The most significant thing perhaps is once more leadership. There, the Ilkhanite's army was skillfully led by Ghazan Ilkhan, who outmaneuvered the Mamluk army and forced it to cross a desert to reach him, while he was camped out at the water source. Meanwhile, the Mamluk command was split. The Sultan, the young al-Nasir Muhammad, only a boy with no control over his feuding emirs. This time the Mamluks opened the first charge, running into Mongol arrows while the Mongol line remained firm but flexible, pushing back at the Mamluks once they connected. Even still, fighting took the rest of the day, with the Mamluk army breaking as night fell. The next day, Ghazan took Damascus, which surrendered without a fight, while the Mamluks fled all the way back to Cairo, abandoning their Levantine possessions. Ghazan soon withdrew though, and he was unable to take advantage of the closest the Mongols ever came to conquering the Mamluks. Throughout the series, I've dealt with a number of battles: Huan Erzui, Parvan, Mohi, Ain Jalut, and more. What I have emphasized throughout is two things. The armies which performed the best offensively against the Mongols tend to be those that could best emulate their tactics. This often involved taking some other steppe nomadic or steppe adjacent people with a tradition of horse archery and putting them in good armor. Only then were range, striking power, and maneuverability combined to make for the most effective counters to Mongol armies in the open. It's not a coincidence that throughout history, most armies that had a successful campaign against a nomadic state tended to do so with some sort of horse archer mercenaries in their service. But this is not the secret to victory. The presence of armor, heavy cavalry, and the like are not single determining factors in victories. Instead, the army with better command generally comes out on top. Good command can make up for inferior weapons and armor, while good equipment doesn't really cancel out a bad general. Good commanders usually result just in less problems for the army, less issues with logistics for supplying horses and men, avoiding poor decisions, keeping morale up in the face of harsh conditions and the enemy, avoiding confusion, and knowing when to deploy the heavy cavalry. The Mongol commanders who experienced setbacks were those who trusted too much in their reputation, underestimated their foes, and timed their cavalry charges wrong. The Mongol heavy cavalry, and really any medieval cavalry force being used as shock cavalry, should not be seen as a wrecking ball or tank because they can't simply run over anything they want to. Instead, they're best used as a precisely timed stabbing motion when the enemy was in confusion or their morale dipped, at which point the power of the cavalry was maximized, the impact of fear tripling the impact of the lances. And the enemy heavy cavalry that worked best against the Mongols were those who understood that and got that timing right.